Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for an episode of Clean Water Casting. These are podcasts sponsored by FloridaRightToCleanWater.org, the organization behind efforts to amend our state constitution, giving all Floridians a fundamental right to clean and healthy waters. I'm Joseph Benazia, Communications Director. In this series, we delve into water quality issues in Florida, speaking with experts who can help us understand these issues and what we need to do to return our waters to health. Our guest today is Mr. Ray Judah. Ray has a BS in zoology and an MS in natural resource management from California State University of Humboldt. From 1983 to 1988, he was the principal environmental planner in Lee County down in Southwest Florida. From 1988 to 2012, he served as Lee County Commissioner. And from 2013 to 2015, he was the executive director of the Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition. Ray, thanks for joining us today and taking the time to talk to us.
It's my pleasure, Joe.
All right. So, what are the quality issues that concern you most issues in Florida down here? Why do they persist? How do they impact the people and the wildlife of Florida?
Yeah, well, to sum it up, Joe, it's really the increase in frequency of the harmful algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course, blue-green algae in the Caloosahatchee River and the Lake Okeechobee. All our waterways are interconnected with Lake Okeechobee and the entire Okeechobee Basin. Unfortunately, what has happened is with the onslaught of continued release of excessive amount of fertilizer, phosphorus and nitrogen, along with the toxic soup of pesticides, fungicides, and insecticides that eventually gets released from Lake Okeechobee down the Caloosahatchee River on the west coast and the St. Lucie River on the east coast. That's the nutrient soup that the algae feeds on. And of course, all the toxic soup nutrients come from the sugarcane fields surrounding Lake Okeechobee. What has happened over the last several decades is that with the increase in frequency and duration of the harmful algae blooms is the die-off of a lot of our wildlife, public health concerns, flesh-eating bacteria that's creating a situation where I, for one, would never recommend swimming in the Gulf of Mexico these days. And so there's a tremendous amount of pollution in the form of not only nutrients, but also the volume of excessive fresh water that's creating havoc with the salinity gradient within our estuaries. So there's a lot of factors that come into play, but it all emanates from the sugarcane fields around Lake Okeechobee.
So you have obviously been working on this issue for decades. Why has it persisted for so long?
It's unfortunate, but the reality, Joe, is that the corrupting influence of the sugar industry, primarily U.S. sugar and Florida crystals, completely has stranglehold government at all levels, local, state, and federal level. You have legislators, you have commissioners, you have congressmen that are pretty well staking their political future on supporting the sugar industry. They are not interested in the appropriate regulations of nutrient runoff that is creating havoc and denigrating our waterways. And unfortunately, because of the lack of political will, we really have no other choice but to bring it to the people. And this right to clean water constitutional amendment is the only way, quite frankly, literally the only way to be able to upgrade and restore our waterways, to restore the Everglades, Florida Bay, to make it safe again for not only residents, but the tourists that travel from all over the world to visit our beaches, to be able to swim and feel comfortable and safe in enjoying our waterways.
Tomorrow I am attending an event sponsored by local Chamber of Commerce. They're going to go over an economic study that was done, and it talks about the cost to our tourist economy in billions of dollars. So I'm sure you are familiar just how much the blue-green algae blooms and the red tides impact our local economy down here. Recently, you wrote an op-ed in which you reminded folks of that common definition of insanity, which was doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, Joe, it's really an insidious situation with the political structure in the state of Florida. They got a closed primary system. Without an open primary system, you're going to continue to get extreme candidates that are heavily funded by corporate interests, primarily the sugar industry. It's well known the sugar industry throws millions into political campaigns for those candidates that carry the water for them, so to speak. And there's just like I said, an insidious situation here where the Republican Party, for instance, although it controls the state of Florida, isn't really the Republican Party in ideology and philosophy. It's a party that's controlled by the sugar industry, to the point that the sugar industry hand selects their candidates, closes off the primaries, making sure that they can get their extreme candidates elected to the state legislature or to Congress, or even to the county commission, and even at the city level, to make sure that their candidates are there advocating their best interest. So there really is very limited hope politically with those that are supposed to represent the public interest, and therein lies the tragedy.
Folks commonly ask, don't we already have enough laws on the books to ensure good water quality? Would you respond to that?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a myth, Joe, because a number of years ago, and it was called, for lack of a better name, the water bill. In fact, it was written at the time when Adam Putnam, who ran for governor, he was the agricultural commissioner at the time, and Matt Caldwell, who was a state representative, who has really turned his back on Southwest Florida. He's now the tax collector. Property appraiser. He actually sponsored that water bill. And what that did, Joe, is it completely transformed the way in which the state of Florida protects its waterways. It went from a regulatory process to a best management voluntary process. So it left it up to the polluters to actually police themselves, and it has failed miserably. So no, there's not sufficient regulations in place to adequately protect our critical waterways.
So you're talking about best management practices on agricultural lands?
Correct. I mean, to the point it's infuriating because, again, it's left up to the polluters to police themselves. And we have seen over the last couple number of years that it has failed miserably because there's really no reduction in terms of the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that continues to plague our waterways. There's still a excessive amount of insecticides and pesticides and fungicides that make up this toxic soup that is released into Lake Okeechobee via back pumping from the sugarcane industry south of Lake Okeechobee, that then gets discharged down the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie into our estuaries. So it's just a vicious cycle in which we're never going to be able to clean up our waterways until we actually can implement some type of constitutional amendment, such as the right to clean water, in which the amendment to that constitution, to the Florida Constitution, would actually take precedent over the lawmakers that are beholden to the sugarcane industry.
I'll let our listeners know that there are 3 other states in the nation that currently have basic environmental constitutional rights, such as we're pursuing here, and there are 20 other states who are also pursuing similar amendments. So Florida is not alone in this regard. A lot of states are suffering from the same problems, and they're seeing this as a solution. Do local governments not have a handle on correcting their local water quality issues?
Well, Joe, I would have to say that I was dismissed back in 2012. I was a commissioner there in Lee County for 24 years, and I was proud of being able to be a tremendous advocate for cleaning up our waterways and taking on the sugar industry. Because of that effort, I got a bullseye on my back, and the sugar industry spent well over $1 million to unseat me back in 2012. Since then, we have had a parade of candidates and commissioners that have either been fearful or have grave trepidation or just don't have the political backbone to take on the sugar industry. And so, no, we don't have the kind of support at the local level in Lee County government to be able to advocate for the importance of buying more land south of the lake for storage and treatment of that runoff before it gets to the Everglades versus sending that toxic soup to the west and east coast of Florida, destroying our estuaries.
I'll also inform our listeners that basically what the amendment says is that if our state agencies are going to permit harm to any of our waters, they must have a compelling state interest to do so. Something somehow more important to the public interests of Floridians than clean and healthy waters. And even when they do have such a compelling interest, such as preventing a flood from Lake O to the surrounding communities, they've got to minimize that harm as much as possible. And when they don't, our fundamental right gives us the standing to take those agencies to court, and then the court, looking at the science, would make the decisions. Aside from the impact of the agricultural industry, do you see the recent explosive growth in South Florida as being a contributor to our water quality problems?
Yeah, there's no question that it's a contributing factor, Joe, but it really is minutia compared to the extensive volume of runoff from the sugarcane fields in order to have optimum growth conditions for their sugarcane. They have an insidious relationship with the South Florida Water Management District, where the Water Management District will manage the water level within the sugarcane fields 18 to 24 inches below ground all year round. So regardless of all the excessive rains that we might receive, the sugar industry is guaranteed that they're going to have optimum growth conditions so they can discharge their water into Lake Okeechobee. That then, as I said, it gets released down the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie. And to put it in perspective, Joe, the C-43 reservoir that's been built, which doesn't have, by the way, a filtration component, will only store about 55 billion gallons of water. There is in excess of 500 billion gallons of water that is discharged down the Caloosahatchee from Lake Okeechobee during excessive rainy seasons. And so the point I'm trying to make is what's in place now, what is supposedly planned under the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, will not address the excessive discharge, the polluted discharge from Lake Okeechobee in terms of storage and filtration. That goes back to where the local officials at the local level, state level legislatures, they need to continue to push to purchase more land south of the lake for the storage and treatment of that runoff versus creating adverse harm to the estuaries on the west and east coast of Florida.
So those projects are costing billions of dollars, and they're mostly about cleaning the water before we send it south. Is there much talk about actually stopping the pollution at the source going into Lake Okeechobee from a lot of these government expenditures?
Well, those stormwater treatment areas that were built years ago south of the lake actually end up receiving water from the sugarcane fields. So these are publicly owned lands that are treating private runoff. Those stormwater treatment areas really should be receiving the water from the lake, not the Everglades agricultural area directly from the sugarcane fields, because they're using public taxpayer money for the use of filtering and storing their runoff. It's insufficient, but nonetheless, it really would help to be able to utilize those storage treatment areas for runoff directly from the lake versus from the sugarcane fields.
Taxpayers are basically shouldering the burden, the financial burden for cleaning up the water polluted by industries.
There's no question about that. In fact, there used to be and in fact, there still is an item on the tax bill in Lee County, in fact, for all the counties within the South Florida Water Management District that pay to manage the piping and the plumbing system within the Everglades agriculture, the sugarcane fields. Taxpayers are paying to store, distribute, release that water. It is taxpayer paid infrastructure, and it is taxpayer land that is used to store and treat sugarcane field runoff. They should be treated like any other developer in the state of Florida, where you have to retain, store, and treat your own runoff in your own backyard on your own property before it's released, and it's not.
Do you think that most Floridians appreciate the degree of harm that our waters are suffering, and do they understand why they're in the conditions they're in?
I would say that's a resounding no. If they appreciated what really is going on in terms of the degradation of our waterways, you would think that would translate to taking the appropriate political action and supporting candidates that want to restore and clean up our waterways, that want to hold the polluters such as the sugar industry accountable. But that's not happening. They're being, I think, misled by the heavy dosage of ads and disinformation from the sugar industry. And you would think, though, that the very reality of the fact that we've got flesh-eating bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico, the degradation of water quality, the destruction of fish and wildlife, that in itself would get people's attention. But it doesn't seem to be strong enough concern at this time to reflect the reality of how our political situation should be in order to protect and safeguard our resources.
I have a 7-year-old grandson. He came down to visit not too long ago. He was in the Caloosahatchee River. He cut his toe on something in the water. It certainly was very, very worrisome to us. He's okay, but folks should not have to worry about going into the waters down here in Florida. Unfortunately, it is a concern. So we have these challenges. We've had them for a long, long time. And this is why folks in Florida and elsewhere are pursuing these constitutional amendments. I know you worked hard at this for decades, and now you are a staunch supporter of our amendment. So we thank you for that. Are there any last comments you would like to share with our listeners today?
Only that this really is an issue that needs to be taken seriously. It's really our environment in the state of Florida is in the balance. And if the people truly want to be the appropriate stewards of our resources, because obviously the legislature is not, that they really need to get behind this right to clean water constitutional amendment and get their friends to help sign the petitions so they can get on the ballot and be supported and get back on the right track to protect our waterways.
Mr. Ray Judah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate your efforts, sir.
To all our listeners, thanks for listening in. I hope you will join us next week for another episode of Clean Water Casting with Florida Right to Clean Water. Everybody have a great day.
Take care now.